Yo, what is up guys, Dream here, and in today's video we're going to talk about the impact of the recently released manifesto for 3.15. So I originally had a full in-depth, really intricate, in-depth, I'll talk about everything. But honestly, it didn't seem too useful and it really didn't convey my message very well. So I scrapped that and we're doing this video instead. So we're not going to be going too much into the nitty gritty. We're basically going to talk about the overall effect that all of these changes are going to have on the game. And I'm not going to focus on the high end as much because, that's really not too affected at all. You're still going to be able to one-shot all the bosses pretty much in the game. They might not be on the same builds. For example, you're not going to be on Cock Indigon anymore, but you're still going to be able to pretty much trivialize the entire game even after all these changes. I imagine there's probably going to be some individual skill nerfs we haven't seen in the manifesto, and if you haven't already read it, I highly recommend going and doing that before watching this video, because this is going to be a reflection on the changes in the video itself. All right, let's get into it. So first of all, I do want to say that a few certain specific playstyle archetypes have been hammered, while a few have been spared from the sweeping changes that have been introduced. So the ones that have been spared primarily seem to be traps, bows, and I believe we have melee. So traditional melee, like your normal slams without the exertions, all sorts of stuff like that. Reeve, all kind of melee sort of archetypes. Bows, which were previously in a really bad place, have received some compensation, and traps seem to be, for the most part, pretty untouched. I think it's pretty good that they're encouraging underpowered, kind of underused archetypes and kind of sparing them a little bit, so maybe that they'll come a little bit up and shine through after all the nerfs are well and done. Now, the reality of this is that I don't think that's actually going to be the case unless we see some substantial nerfs in the actual patch notes themselves to some of the more powerful skills in the game, such as like Toxic Rain, ED Contagion, and Mines, all sorts of stuff like that. If they don't get further nerfs to their specific gems or increase significant nerfs for the more powerful ones, we're just going to see the exact same metagame all over again, because the overall kind of package of these nerfs is not enough to nerf these kind of high powerful playstyles to the point in which they're not able to do all content in the game, with a few exceptions. So if you were looking forward to starting Toxic Rain, ED Contagion, Freeze Pulse Ice Spear, any sort of build like that, unless we see those nerfs that I was speaking about on the patch notes, most likely those are still going to be the best builds overall, as kind of like they have been in the past. So that's point one. There are a few archetypes though that did take heavy nerfs, and they were definitely outliers overall, and those are Slams, as well as Archmage. So Slams obviously have been a massive dominant driving force in the racing scene, the hardcore scene, and they didn't actually see too much play in softcore. That doesn't detract from the fact though that they are one of the most powerful builds on a low budget and a go-to option for more experienced players to completely steamroll all content in the game. You're able to invest heavily in defenses and able to leverage insane more multipliers on your gems and your passive skill tree to essentially just blow through the content with pretty much no gear to be able to have at all, which is definitely not what you want. So that's been hammered. They've removed basically Seismic Cry from the game, which is, it's definitely a decision. It is what it is. Next up, let's talk about Archmage. Archmage is absolutely being annihilated, it seems. It's probably, I would estimate, about a 70% nerf when you take into account the skill gem, the Mana Flask nerf, the Flask nerf overall, the Arcane Surge nerf, and the Ascendancy nerfs. It's probably about a power amount reduced, I would say. Obviously, I could be a bit off on that number, but we have to wait until we get the exact numbers and path of building it all. But it is definitely a sizable reduction in power. Now, Archmage, arguably was one of the best, if not the best builds in the game in the softcore scene at the lower investment level and the higher investment level. And that should, in my opinion, be one of the main primary targets to be nerfed. And it indeed has been nerfed quite significantly. Now, do I think that this build is no longer viable? Absolutely not. I'm absolutely sure you're probably still going to be able to achieve 2 to 3 million DPS quite easily on low budget gear, and you're still going to have incredible defense in the form of, Agnostic, as well as Mind Over Matter, and stuff like that. Are you going to be able to achieve the amount of massive mana regeneration that you're used to? Perhaps not, and that might make it meaning that you need to invest more and more, specifically if you were relying on, for example, the Pathfinder Ascendancy, leveraging Cluster Jewels to get that mana regeneration through the Flask, because that has been heavily nerfed. So Archmage overall is probably another one of those that have been absolutely slammed, no pun intended. Overall, I still fully expect it to be very, very viable and quite powerful still with higher investment. I do think it's probably still viable on the lower end, but you might need to invest a little bit more to get to the point in which it's able to do, for example, Shaper, Maven, etc. Definitely quite there. The unfortunate thing for Archmage though is if you were playing a mana-based crit build, you also get hit with the following change that we're going to talk about here. So another massive one, of course, is the absolutely colossal nerfs to Critical Strike. So Critical Strike, the main loss is the Diamond Flask. So Diamond Flask has been changed from a lucky chance to inflict a critical strike on consumption to 100% increased critical strike. So lucky essentially means it rolls your critical strike chance twice. It doesn't quite double your crit chance, but that's kind of the effect it ends up with in the end. And overall, it is now changed to 100%, which is about on par with a pretty good node on the tree. Maybe like half a good node or like a pretty good node, etc. So this King of the Hill node is 80% crit chance with bows. It's like kind of around that area. So that's definitely a colossal nerf. And if you're a crit-based build, you're going to get hit with the support change, and you're also going to get hit with the crit change, which is a pretty big deal. And if you were a build that did about 2 million DPS and you were just scraping by on the endgame bosses, you're probably going to be knocked out of being able to do them very, very easily anymore. But if you were a 5 or 6 million DPS build, like your Freezing Pulse Ice Spear builds, you're probably still going to do just fine, and you're probably still going to be able to wipe the floor with Maven, Shaper, Urelda, etc. Now, of course, the exception is that lower tier build. If you got knocked down from 2 mil down to like 1 mil or 800k, that's where you're going to have to probably go back to the drawing board and take a look at some of the other builds that are coming out and people are coming up with. There's plenty of builds still to have and do all the content with. You might just have to kind of look and innovate in other areas. Or you may want to take it a little bit slower, and you will probably feel a bit slower on those Shaper kills. But overall, not a big deal. It's not going to completely warp the metagame or change anything overall. Crit is still going to be a fantastic way to scale damage, and it's probably going to be the primary way you still scale your damage as a hit-based build overall, and I don't expect too much to change. You're probably going to see it be less affected in the high-end things because people were actually capping their crit without a Diamond Flask at the high end of things, but the low end of things is where you're really going to see the biggest kick in the teeth and where you're really going to notice it. So in your league start scenarios, that is definitely where it's going to hurt, and you may want to invest in further critical strike nodes on the tree, or you may want to look into converting your build into Elemental Overload, for example, to kind of mitigate that loss a little bit if you want to kind of go down that route. In addition to that, you did also see stuff like Control Destruction get a hit, which is also going to impact the viability of like a lot of builds, like Spellcaster builds and stuff like that, which went crit based, and we're able to just throw that in there as well. You're no longer going to be able to afford that. If you're a crit based build, you're not going to be able to have Control Destruction, as well as like losing your Diamond Flask on top of that. It's going to be pretty rough. So overall, you're probably not going to want to look into that too much that direction. So yeah, crit definitely a big nerf. Next up, we have some movement speed nerfs. People are kind of saying Zoom is dead. Absolutely not. That's nonsense. It's going to take a lot more than a 22% nerf on a Quicksilver Flask and removal of Onslaught from one of the Raider nodes to nerf Zoom. Certainly not. Zoom is going to go pretty much exactly the same speed as we know and love, especially if you were someone who used a Headhunter. Even if you didn't use a Headhunter, you're pretty much going to be used to going the same speed if you're a Zoomer. Where this does have a little bit more impact, though, is on the lower end of things. Again, if you only had a Quicksilver Flask and your boots as a primary source of movement and mobility, you will notice this a little bit more, but I don't expect it to be earth-shattering amounts of reduced movement speed. You're not going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm a snail. It's not going to happen, guys. You're going to be going at a similar speed to normal. Not a big deal. I'm not overly concerned about that. The Flask changes overall are a little bit questionable, in my opinion. It's not how I would have gone about the Flask rework, but it is what it is. The ailment mitigation and stuff like that, it is what it is. Not how I would have gone about it, but they're essentially trying to bring these mechanics back into the fold and into the player's focus instead of being irrelevant, which they were for the longest time. So we now have to think about them. Are they fun to think about? I'm not sure. We'll have to play with them to really find out. Can't test a game without actually testing it, so I'm going to do just that. I don't know enough about Poison overall, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the Flame Dash changes. A lot of people are saying that these skills are dead. Second Wind certainly isn't going to be used ever again in its current state. They should have just removed this from the game, in my opinion. But Flame Dash are certainly going to be pretty much the same amount of use in my opinion. I'm still going to be using Flame Dash. The changes overall are just going to mean I can't use it as much, which is, you know, whatever. Dash, it was used a little bit more as a primary movement skill, so it's probably going to be a little bit less feels good man. But overall, you're probably still going to see just as many people using Dash and Flame Dash as they did before. Overall, I think that, you know, pretty much all builds have been taken down in power by probably about 60%. Dot builds took the cluster jewel nerfs. You know, crit builds took the crit flask nerf. Everyone took the support gem nerf. You know, minions and totems probably took it the least. And those were previously the best builds to start with anyway. So overall, I think the impact to the metagame will be as such. If you were a borderline kind of progression player, you were only just able to get to Cyrus 8 and kill him, and it took 10 minutes, you're probably going to have to go back to the drawing board and power up your PoE knowledge. If you were someone who blasted through Cyrus on, 3 or 4 mil, 5 or 6 mil, you're not going to have any difference in your gameplay at all outside of ailments and adjusting to the new flasks, and that's pretty much my assessment. You might want to go with a bit of a different build if you were playing a crit heavy, build that like, was Archmage or something like that. But outside of that, you're pretty much the same stay the course, boys. Pretty much all good. The overall metagame, I'm hoping, is going to receive a few more tweaks, to stuff like Bladefall, Blade Blast, Brands, Mines. All of these things are absent from the manifesto. If these don't get further hits, they will be played as much as they're played now, and we will see the exact same identical League Start meta that we've seen right now, perhaps with a few newer of the skill gems sprinkled in. If they do get hit, we're probably going to see people start to innovate and come up with some new League Starters, although we only do have 2 days, so it could be an absolute train and car crash, but we have no idea. Overall, I think that it's probably going to be a pretty exciting time to play. If you're a build creator and you're an innovator, there's a lot of new things to try out, there's a lot of unknowns, and I think overall, there's not really much to worry about. If you're a speed zoomer, everything is still there for you. If you're a min maxer, the only thing you've really lost is Ashling, and that is a big loss, but that remains to be seen on how that plays out. Overall, it's probably a power reduction on the crafting side of things, but most people didn't really get to engage with that anyway, so it's probably not a massive deal for your average player anyway. So overall, the game's going to be really, really fun still. It's going to be a lot more challenging, and it's going to be business as usual, I would imagine, with some new builds thrown in. So all that said, guys, hope you guys enjoyed my short assessment here of the manifesto. Bit of a different style, but nonetheless, look forward to some videos. They're all going to be League Start related now, and you're going to get some juicy info coming up. With all that said, see you guys in the next one. Cheers.